When her family announced their decision to her, Jane nearly fainted. Pale and shaken, she looked at her father's face, burning with excitement, and at her enthusiastic father-in-law and his relatives, but she could hardly understand why all these people were so thrilled at the prospect of moving closer to the throne. She was supposed to become queen? Never. But then, one of those present quietly said, "Jane, for the sake of faith, you know that otherwise, England will be drawn back into the fold of the papacy." And something inside her shifted. She was never crowned, though she remains in her country's history as Queen Jane Grey. Her reign lasted only 9 days, but in that short time, the unfortunate girl, just 16 years old, experienced the full force of intrigue, betrayal, and deception from those closest to her. But how did she, who never sought the English throne, become queen? And why did Jane have to pay with her life for the mistakes of others? What was she like, this accidental young queen? To begin Jane Grey's story plainly, she hardly stood a chance of wearing the crown of England. She was born in 1537 into the family of Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk. Through her mother, Jane was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII. In the line of succession, she wasn't even among the top 3. Only after the young King Edward VI took the throne was she considered the 4th in line to inherit. You'll agree, with odds like that, Jane herself could never have dreamed of becoming queen. At most, she might have hoped to serve as regent for a future son of the king. But even that was unlikely. Fate, however, had other plans. We know very little about Jane's childhood and youth. The reason is simple. Few contemporaries saw her as an important figure worth paying attention to. Still, it's known that for some time the girl was raised in the household of Thomas Seymour and his wife, Catherine Parr. The years she spent with that family were the happiest of Jane's life. She remembered fondly the cozy atmosphere and sense of freedom she found in the Seymour home. Interestingly, her own parents treated her far worse than these outsiders did. For example, the scholar Roger Ascham, who personally spoke with Jane, noted that she complained to him about her mother and father's harshness. He recounted her words like this: "I am sharply criticized, I endure threats, and sometimes I am even pinched, my hair is pulled, and other such things are done. I feel as though I am in hell." Many historians believe Jane was an intelligent and well-educated young woman. Her father, despite his harshness, was known as one of the most progressive men in England at the time. No lifetime portraits of Jane survive, but many writers have chosen to depict her with a book in her hands. Moreover, she was deeply religious, raised in the Protestant faith. She saw Catholicism as a threat not only to her own beliefs, but to the entire country. These views, without a doubt, were also shaped by her father's influence. The death of Catherine Parr was a great misfortune for young Jane. What's more, from that moment on, Thomas Seymour began to see his ward as a tool to achieve his own ambitions, namely, gaining power and influence. According to Seymour's plan, Jane was to marry King Edward VI. In that case, the young monarch would have been entirely under Seymour's control, making him the de facto ruler. Had Seymour succeeded, English history, and Jane's own life, might have taken a completely different path. But Seymour was accused of treason, and Jane was forced to return to her parents' home. Interestingly, there too, conversations about the girl's future were underway, and once again, her relatives hoped to use her to gain power and influence at court. The young King Edward was not in good health, and his serious illness left little hope for recovery. Many understood that the monarch would not live long, but this was of particular concern to the regent, John Dudley. Fearing he might lose his comfortable position, Dudley began looking for someone who could help him secure a place within the royal family even after the king's death. His choice fell on Jane, whose parents were more than willing to form an alliance with the powerful nobleman. No, John Dudley had no intention of marrying the young lady himself. Instead, he arranged for her to marry his son, Guilford. What we know of Jane's feelings toward him comes only from letters written by Italians living in England at the time. They claimed the girl never loved her husband and opposed the marriage, but was forced to yield to her parents' will. The publisher Girolamo Rosselli wrote that Jane seemed to sense the danger that marriage would bring. Undoubtedly, intelligent and perceptive as she was, she understood perfectly well that both her own parents and the Dudleys were trying to use her as a pawn. Yet she was given no choice. John Dudley, now Jane's father-in-law, was terrified at the prospect of Mary Tudor coming to power. She was the rightful heir to the throne after her younger brother, King Edward. That's why the cunning regent used persuasion and manipulation to convince the king to change the rules of succession. Edward signed a document stating that, after his death, Jane Grey was to become queen. On the evening of July 6, 1553, Edward VI passed away. As soon as the news broke, Dudley and his allies informed Jane that she was now the Queen of England. It's hard to say how the 16-year-old girl reacted to this news. One book vividly describes this moment. The author writes that Jane first fainted, but upon recovering, she made a truly royal promise. Lady Jane stood up and told all the assembled lords that she had never dreamed of greatness, but if it was her destiny to reign, she asked for God's blessing to govern the country, for His glory and for the good of her people. Before announcing Jane's new status, Dudley sent one of his sons to the palace. He ordered the arrest of Mary Tudor, who could interfere with their bold plan to proclaim a new queen. However, Mary proved faster and more cunning than Dudley's men. She fled the palace and headed to East Anglia, where her supporters were already gathering. It was then that a fierce but brief struggle unfolded across the country. Each side was led by a woman. It's difficult to say whether Jane Grey was an independent political actor. Certainly, she ascended the throne solely due to pressure from her relatives. Yet, in the very first days of her reign, Jane proved herself to be a brilliant orator. She undoubtedly believed she had been given the opportunity to protect England from the spread of Catholicism. The Queen urged the English to join the fight against Mary Tudor, who was already raising an army in the east of the country. Alas, Jane's passionate speeches failed to resonate with her subjects. In the capital, her words were met with indifference, neither opposing nor supporting the Queen. Meanwhile, in East Anglia, Mary was gaining significant strength. The future ruler found many allies there who were willing to fight for her and seek justice. In this confrontation, the balance of power was clearly not in Jane's favor. Choosing to act preemptively, John Dudley also gathered an army and marched east. He intended to strike first and defeat Mary, but the Queen's father-in-law failed to consider one thing. Rebellion was brewing within his own troops, and more people were defecting to the side of rebellious Mary. Jane did not sit idly by either. She announced that she was taking personal command of the Tower Guard and began assembling her own army, placing her beloved cousins in charge. But here, too, the girl faced failure. The relative she trusted most had long since switched sides to support Mary. They, too, were conspirators plotting to overthrow Grey. But the deepest wound for Jane was the betrayal of her own father. He ordered his soldiers to lay down their arms and swear loyalty to Mary Tudor. That was the final blow, one the young queen could no longer withstand. Just 9 days after her reign began, Jane was arrested. Mary became the new queen, later earning the grim nickname Bloody Mary from her subjects. Interestingly, Mary didn't originally plan to punish her predecessor harshly. Instead, she unleashed her fury on the Dudley family, who had been the true masterminds behind the plot. Yet, Mary saw no need to persecute the Greys. In fact, Jane's father managed to buy his pardon with a large sum of money owed to the crown, a debt Mary later forgave. Contemporary observers of the 9 Days Queen noted that Mary Tudor intended to spare Jane's life, but foreign diplomats and Catholic supporters soon began weaving their intrigues. Under their pressure, Mary was forced to keep Jane imprisoned and eventually signed her death warrant. To Mary's credit, she made several attempts to commute the sentence to something less severe. By her order, clergymen visited Jane multiple times, urging the prisoner to convert to Catholicism. But Jane, resigned to her fate, refused to betray her Protestant beliefs. The day of her execution drew ever closer. A priest sent to Jane begged for 3 more days, hoping to convince her to accept the new faith. But Jane refused again and again. On the morning of February 12th, she was led out to Tower Hill. The girl tied her own blindfold, as tradition required, but then suddenly lost her sense of direction, unable to locate the execution block. A bystander helped her approach the place of execution. After the sentence was carried out, a final letter from Jane was found inside her prayer book, addressed to the tower's commander. As the preacher said, "There's a time to be born and a time to die, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. Your friend, God knows, Jane Dudley." At just 16 years old, this reluctant queen who had been thrust onto the throne lived through a lifetime of sorrow, fear, betrayal, and intrigue in only 9 days. Despite some acts of her own will, Jane remained a pawn in the hands of skilled players. This time, the conspirators miscalculated and lost, but Jane Grey paid the ultimate price with her life. Still, even after her death, the unfortunate queen continued to inspire people to resist cruel Catholic rulers. She became England's first Protestant martyr, and her story came to symbolize the ruthless reign of Bloody Mary.